This is Module 4, Wordiness, or more precisely, how to remove wordiness. We're going to look at some common ways people are wordy and learn how to remove them. Let's start with something easy. Empty phrases that can be deleted on sight. You don't have to rephrase these, just delete them. 2 phrases that start with an empty placeholder it. It has been found that, or it was shown to be. These phrases can simply be deleted. If you want to insist on a piece of information coming from a particular research team, you can put that as a reference at the end of the sentence. Placing this at the beginning of the sentence adds more wordiness, and it means that you cannot effectively use your topic position. Another phrase, as it is well known. Here again we have the placeholder it, but simply the meaning of this phrase is a bit redundant. If it's so well known, then you don't need to tell the reader that it's well known, do you? Next words, important, interesting, and interestingly. Your goal should be to make the reader think, oh, this must be important, or oh, how interesting. You should not have to tell them that something is important. Usually what happens is a writer tells the reader that something is important, and then the reader thinks, oh, is this important? Why? Because the writer has forgotten to explain clearly why something is important. Same for interesting. The writer usually forgets to explain why something is interesting and thinks that it's enough to tell the reader that it's interesting. But if the reader's response is, I don't know, I don't find that interesting at all, then the writer has not succeeded anyway. So please remove these words and ask yourself if you've explained clearly why something is important or why something is interesting. The next phrase, differences have been found. You can remove this and simply tell me what the differences are that have been found. You don't need to preface it with anything. Next, research has shown, research has found. Research is a vague word, any research. It's not so useful to put that in your topic position because that's not familiar to the reader. Also, if you want to name a particular team that showed or found something, you can put them in a reference at the end of the sentence. Or you can add them on to the end of the sentence that they found them, but it's generally not so good to put them in the topic position because then your sentence becomes about that research team rather than about the topic that you were talking about before. Now here's another empty phrase to delete on sight. The phrase there is or there are whenever it adds nothing. Occasionally you'll be able to use there is or there are, but be careful with them in a sentence like this. There were too few participants willing to continue the study. In this sentence we can very easily remove there were. We can make too few participants our subject and add a verb. Too few participants were willing to continue the study. It's a more concise sentence, and it's a sentence with a more specific subject, participants, a human subject, which is great for our topic position. Next, there seems to be some effect of experience on widening this window. This sentence is difficult to understand. First, we can remove there seems to be, and take from that the writer is trying to tell us that they're unsure. It's not completely sure yet. And then some effect of experience. We know that effect can be a verb, so experience affects widening this window, but widen is also a verb, so simply experience may widen this window. If we go back to subject, verb, object, structure, in this sentence we get experience may widen this window, which is a lot shorter than there seems to be some effect of experience on widening this window. Which leads us into our next slide, which is phrases with long lists of prepositional phrases, preposition, noun, preposition, noun, preposition, noun, tend to be wordy and nonsensical, meaning they don't make sense to the reader. For example, there is an effect of age of acquisition on speech. When you connect words together with only prepositions, it's very difficult to see how they link together. When we read, we need to see verbs. And here we've got no verbs except for the is at the beginning. Here, what they're trying to say is age of acquisition affects speech. Here, they're trying to say grammar affects golf putting. So please be careful when you have lists or strings of prepositional phrases, an effect of age of acquisition on speech, or an effect of grammar on golf putting. Let's look at some long phrases that we can simply reduce. The experimental demonstration can become simply the experiment, due to the fact that is a long phrase that can be summed up in one word. Because, have an effect on. This is something that we talked about when we talked about verbs. Effect could be considered a zombie noun here. We can simply use the verb, which is affect with an A. At the present moment could become now or currently. Now let's move on to talking about synonyms. The problem with synonyms is that they do not have the exact same meaning. So when you use them, you're actually confusing the reader. You're trying to avoid being completely repetitive by going to the thesaurus and choosing another word that is like the first word that you used, but not exactly. So you end up with words like we illustrated and then we demonstrate. Or you end up with something like X is favorable, Y is desirable. The trouble with this is that they really confuse the reader. The reader is asking themselves, what's the difference between the two different words that you've chosen? What's the difference between illustrating something and demonstrating something? Why did you choose a different word? You must mean something different. Or, if X is favorable and Y is desirable, well, do you mean to tell me that one of them is better than the other? What exactly is the difference between favorable and desirable? Or do you simply mean to say that X and Y are both favorable? If you simply apply parallelism, you won't have too much repetition, you won't have to go to the thesaurus, and you could simply repeat keywords as you need them. I'll talk about keywords again in a moment. Let's first talk about adjectives and adverbs. Some people recommend deleting all adjectives and adverbs to avoid wordiness. Occasionally you might find use for them, but be careful with the ones that are only redundant. For example, if you have a phrase like successful solutions, a solution is always successful, otherwise it wouldn't be a solution, it would be an attempt. So to say successful solutions, that's simply saying the same thing twice. The same thing goes for a phrase like a general overview. Overviews are by definition general, so there's no need to ever have the word general in front of an overview. You can avoid difficulty with synonyms, with adjectives and adverbs by choosing a few keywords and repeating them exactly. Like we talked about with parallelism, some repetition has a purpose. You might think that it will sound dull to repeat the same keywords over and over, but actually it won't, and I would like to show you why. Here's an example from Steven Pinker's book, The Sense of Style, The Thinking Person's Guide to Writing in the 21st Century. And here I've taken a number of excerpts from Chapter 2, A Window onto the World. Chapter 2 is about classic style. In these excerpts, he has taken particular phrases and he repeats the phrases each time exactly. And he does this in order to bring the reader back to a specific point that he's trying to make, and to emphasize to the reader that this phrase is important. The more often he repeats a particular phrase, the more likely it is to stick into the reader's mind, and for the reader to think, this is important. I need to remember this. Let me read to you. The reader is competent and can recognize the truth when she sees it, as long as she is given an unobstructed view. The writer and the reader are equals, and the process of directing the reader's gaze takes the form of a conversation. And then later, he writes, in classic style, the writer has worked hard to find something worth showing, and the perfect vantage point from which to see it. Notice the repetition of the see, and we have view and a vantage point. One of the uses of passive voice is indispensable to classic style. The passive allows the writer to direct the reader's gaze, like a cinematographer choosing the best camera angle. Here, this is the second time that we see direct the reader's gaze. But it's better to keep in mind the guiding metaphor of classic style. A writer, in conversation with a reader, directs the reader's gaze to something in the world. That's the third time we see directs the reader's gaze, and the second time I've given you conversation. Classic style is not the only way to write, but it's an ideal that can pull writers away from many of their worst habits, and it works particularly well because it makes the unnatural act of writing seem like two of our most natural acts, talking and seeing. With that repetition, particular phrases were emphasized. They are phrases that I will have a tendency to remember as I finish that chapter. And that's how you show the reader that something is important, by repeating things with intent. Let me give you another example of how we can repeat with intent. Here are two sentences. Ms. A and Mr. B both struck a careful balance between consensual and confrontational leadership styles. The cases of these two people suggest that Dutch politicians have considerable leeway in how exactly to strike that balance. This writer could have chosen not to repeat this phrase, strike a balance, and instead could have said something vague at the end of the sentence like, have considerable leeway in how to do that. They wouldn't have gained that many words, but they would have had it at a cost of the lack of repetition of striking a balance. And if the writer wants to emphasize that it's about striking a balance, then repeating this phrase multiple times will imprint that on the reader's mind. Here's another example. This Dutch political practice of consensus, compromise, and consultation has the advantage of generating oversized coalitions that provide policy stability even when there is turnover in the political color of the government. On the other hand, consensus, compromise, and consultation does slow down the policy-making process. Why did the writer here decide to repeat the phrase consensus, compromise, and consultation instead of just saying this practice or this political practice? Especially if this is a phrase that was a bit more unknown to the reader, the writer has chosen to try to imprint it into the reader's mind, to emphasize that this is important, this practice, and it's called consensus, compromise, and consultation. The writer is essentially waving a flag here at me, the reader, saying, hey, don't forget, consensus, compromise, and consultation. This is important. Pay attention to this. Here's how you can avoid telling the reader something is important, by showing them something is important. Here I have one more example of repetition for a purpose, with some parallelism and repetition. When one is investigating scientific evidence, one must consider the full body of information, or survey the full body of water. Notice the parallelism there. And if the body is large, notice the repetition there to take something from the sentence before. This becomes an impossible task for one single person. To continue, let us talk about jargon and how it can also be wordy. Ideally, you will use a jargon that is more specific and precise than normal English. But there are two kinds of jargon, and while the one is more specific and precise than what can be said in normal English, the other is more vague and ambiguous than normal English. Sometimes the more vague and ambiguous jargon is let loose in your writing, and it can be hard to identify. So let me give you some examples. Take this, for example. Participants were tested under conditions of good to excellent acoustic isolation. This sounds pretty fancy, doesn't it? This sounds precise. What are conditions of good to excellent acoustic isolation? Maybe it's determined somewhere, and the good to excellent is a particular rating that they're using. In this situation, it's not at all. It just sounds fancy, but means nothing. In this sentence, we don't actually know what did they do to test the participants. What were the conditions of good to excellent acoustic isolation? Did they give the participants headphones to block out noise? Did they lock them up in a soundproof room? Did they bring them to a farm 50 kilometers outside of town to get away from all noise? What did they do? Would I be able to repeat this experiment with the information that I'm given in this sentence? I wouldn't. I need something more specific, and in this case, I need normal English. We tested the students in a quiet room. It's more concise, and it's more precise. Let me give you another example of this. Jargon. We believe that the ICTS approach to delivering integrated solutions, which combines effective manpower, canine services, and cutting-edge technology, was a key differentiator in the selection process. What does this sentence mean? It means they chose our company because we protect buildings with a combination of guards, dogs, and sensors. And while the first sentence sounds fancy, nobody understands what the first sentence means. So a jargon-sounding text doesn't actually help anyone, and it creates a much more wordy sentence. So I hope that you will feel comfortable choosing more normal English in your writing, rather than thinking that you have to use jargon-sounding words, because you don't. Only use them if they actually add more precision than what you can achieve in normal English. Let us practice with removing some wordiness. First, this paper provides a review of. Change the noun review to a verb and you get this paper reviews. Next, if you remove levels, then you get X lowers blood pressure. Next, a majority of becomes most. Next, this becomes to determine. This becomes in identifying. This becomes simply to. This becomes until. This becomes blacks. Now, I'd like to end by showing you how you can restructure a sentence in multiple ways by applying these principles that I've shown you in these modules: parallelism, verbs, the information flow principle. Here we have a sentence. However, a recent study reported only a limited effect of these publication guidelines on reporting practices. What can we see in the sentence? We see the subject is a recent study. So now the sentence is about the study, and the main verb is reported. There is no other verb in the sentence. There's simply a list of noun, preposition, noun, which makes it difficult for the reader to see what the relationship is between the nouns. So what can we do? First, we can keep a study reported, that, and we could try to change it into subject, verb, object. These publication guidelines have only a limited effect on reporting practices. Then if we look at this sentence, we can see that, oh, actually, we still have a zombie noun in that sentence with effect. We could make it even shorter and more concise by using effect as a verb. These publication guidelines do not affect reporting practices very much. And then we can play with it. These publication guidelines do not significantly affect the way results are being reported. We don't have to keep reporting practices. We can also use report as a verb and see how that looks, what we prefer. And then we can also change it up and decide that maybe publication guidelines is not given information. It's not familiar information. It shouldn't go in the topic position. Maybe something else should go in the topic position. Maybe I could try to put reporting practices in the topic position. And then I have passive voice. And then I end with publication guidelines as new information. This would be relevant if the whole paragraph was about reporting practices, and reporting practices should actually be the topic. When you're choosing between active voice and passive voice, one of the reasons to choose passive voice would be because you need to get one particular piece of information in the topic position, like we did here with number 4. That's a perfectly legitimate reason to use passive voice. So here you have many choices with your sentence. This to show you that restructuring a sentence that is wordy and unclear to begin with, it can go through different layers. The first sentence that you get might still be a little bit wordy, and then you change it a little bit more, and you change it around, and then you end up with a couple, you compare them, and then finally at the end you decide on the one that you want. Editing is not always straightforward. It's not that you immediately know what the answer is. Sometimes you really have to work with it, like we worked with this sentence here, to figure out what our options are. One thing that I can tell you is when you're restructuring, try to give yourself more than 2 options, if possible. If you can think of more than 2 options, challenge yourself to give yourself more than 2, and that will help you to open your mind a little bit to all the different ways you could structure your sentence. Good luck!